In Numbers chapter 13, begin reading with me in verse 26, please. Now they departed and came back to Moses and Aaron and all the congregation of the children of Israel in the wilderness of Paran. At Kadesh, they brought back word to them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. Then they told him and said, "We went to the land where you sent us. It truly flows with milk and honey, and this is the fruit. Nevertheless, the people dwell in the land are strong. The cities are fortified and very large. Moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the south. The Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites dwell in the mountains. The Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the banks of the Jordan." Then Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, "Let us go up at once and take possession, for we are well able to overcome it." But the men who had gone up with him said, "We're not able to go up against the people, for they're stronger than we." And they gave the children of Israel a bad report of the land, which they had spied out, saying, "The land through which we have gone as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants. All the people whom we saw in it are men of great stature. There we saw the giants, the descendants of Anak. They came from the giants, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight." And so all the congregation lifted up their voices and cried, and the people wept that night. And the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron. And the whole congregation said to them, "If only we had died in the land of Egypt, or only if we had died in this wilderness. Why has the Lord brought us to this land to fall by the sword, that our wives and our children should become victims? Would it not be better for us to return to Egypt?" So they said to one another, "Let us select a leader and return to Egypt." Then Moses and Aaron fell on their faces before all the assembly of the congregation of the children of Israel. But Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes. And they spoke to all the congregation of the children of Israel, saying, "The land which we passed through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, then he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, nor fear the people of the land, for they are our bread. Their protection has departed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them." And all the congregation said to stone them with stones. Now the glory of the Lord appeared in the tabernacle of meeting before all the children of Israel. In Deuteronomy chapter 1, it says that when they came across the Red Sea, that they were 8 days' journey from the promised land. 8 days' journey. Given all the mechanisms that had to be set up in place, the giving of the law, setting up at the tabernacle, all the things that went with taking the Sinai and the revelation of the commandments. If we do a timeline of that, probably that 8 days could have been within 60 days. They could have been in the promised land. 60 days, they could have been in the promised land. But instead, it took them 40 years. That is a long way to make a short journey. And the reason is because their hearts were turned back because of a lack of faith. In fact, Deuteronomy chapter 1, it will say, "Because you believed me not." Because you believed me not. The majority report was, "We're not able." They enter the land. They see the size of the people in the land. They see the walls of the cities. And there's something about the land that it says it devours its inhabitants. Caleb pled. Joshua pled with them. Please don't do this. Please don't go there. God has told us he will give us the land. The land is ours. Wherever we put our foot, we will possess it. God has promised to give us the land. But they cried, "We are not able." I will tell you, that's the challenge of man ever since this event. It's the challenge of whether we walk by sight or whether we walk by faith. Because everything they said about the land was true. Everything they said about the people in the land, they were bigger. They were as grasshoppers in their sight. Everything they said about the walls were great. And whatever it was about the land devouring them, that was there. You see the produce of the land, when they bring it back, it takes multiple men to carry the amount of produce they bring back from the land to show how plentiful it is, how it flowed with milk and honey. But with all of that, with all that God has provided for them up to this point, they still come to the place in the land, come to the place before the river and say, we are not able. They put their faith and their confidence in a being that was unable to deliver them, and that was man himself. And they failed to put their confidence in the being that could deliver them, that is Jehovah God. God had been with them, and God said, I will be with you. The land is yours. You will take the land. There are three things I'm going to touch real quickly. They failed to see that God was bigger than the giants, and that God was greater than the walls, and that the land ate its inhabitants. When it says that God was bigger than the giants, the sons of Anak were there. You remember when Goliath meets David, that he's this enormous size. There was a fellow used to be in professional wrestling called Andre the Giant. He was probably about 8 or 9 feet tall, well over 300 pounds, intimidating by his size. Even he would have made Goliath look like a pygmy. And these giants here would have made Goliath look small. David comes up against Goliath after Saul and the brothers of David refused to go up against Goliath. And he says, who is this Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? You are a walking dead man. How could David say that? He's a runt. Because in watching his father's sheep, he killed a bear and a lion with his own bare hands. Not because David was smarter and stronger than a lion and a bear, but because God had delivered them. And he said, if God will deliver them to me, then God will deliver this giant to me. I don't care what giants we face. God is bigger than our giants. In Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 14, it says that Jesus came to conquer death. Death is Satan's greatest asset. As large as Goliath was, as large as Andre the Giant was, they were no match for the adversary of how great Satan is. But God is greater than Satan. And God can conquer even the thing that Satan held as his trump card, and that is death. Whether it be spiritual death because of salvation or physical death because of resurrection, God is able to conquer. God is able to defeat Satan and his adversary. God has not died. This scene, this story, the story of this story did not die with a cross. The story of this story was true before the cross, true before the cross and after the cross. It is the story of putting our faith in God and not shrinking back because of putting our faith in sight. They were greater than the walls. They come to Nineveh. Nineveh wall is 100 feet tall. The thickness kind of tapered, but it was large enough on top that you could have chariot races with chariots running abreast on top of the wall. It seemed impregnable. But God made a great flood come. And with that great flood, the wall was made of adobe. And as a result of that, the waters melted away the wall. And the armies marched in. Babylon saw that and said, oh, we're going to make compensation for that. So they made a diversion canal that water would flow under the wall and thought they were safe. But instead, the Medes and the Persians caused the waters to dry up. And they marched through on dry land. They come to Jericho. The walls are great. The walls are high. How are they going to conquer these walls? In the most unconventional way. No general walking by sight would have dared assault the city like they did. They marched around the walls one time each day for 6 days, and 7 times the 7th day, and then blew their trumpets and horns, and the walls came tumbling down. Why? Because God gave them the walls. Paul will talk about in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, the casting down of strongholds and fortresses. You had the fortress, which would have been the protection of the inner wall of the outside wall. You had the outside wall, then you would have had an inner wall with its particular gun settings or places for fighting inside that wall. And he said they would be cast down like you'd take a winch and you would break and you would tighten them down. Those walls would come tumbling down. God would tear down those walls. God was greater than the walls. And you think about the land. Have you ever considered the fact that the most vulnerable time for the children of Israel was their time on the Sabbath? It was their time on the Sabbath, and not a single time were the children of Israel assaulted on the Sabbath. You have 7 nations that are more powerful than the children of Israel. The children of Israel would be like flicking a fly off your collar as far as the 7 nations were concerned, and their strength and the impotence of Israel. But here God protected His people. God protected His people on this Sabbath day. In fact, the only time that God's people ever suffered was when they decided they could be strong enough on their own. You remember after Jericho? Remember after Jericho what happens? They think they're strong enough, and so they go to Ai and they leave God behind. And Ai, a smaller army, much weaker army than the Israelites, puts them to flight. And now they come back and say, why did we lose? Because you left God off. Every time God's people have left God out of the equation, God's people have suffered defeat. I would suggest that's no different today for us. When we leave God out of the equation, when we have the God factor in our equation, we are greater than the giants, we are greater than the walls, and we're greater than the land. Not because we are so great. We're not able to. We're not able to conquer anything that we face today on our own. We are unable to do that. But God is able to strengthen us with great might. Ephesians chapter 3 and verses 14 through 16, He strengthens us with great might, mightily in the inner man. He strengthens us with great might. When? When we put our trust and our confidence and our faith in Him and His vision and in His purpose, and not in our vision and not in our purpose. Now, I'm saying all this for this. We're opening back up. Today, we're going to have our Bible classes after this hour. And then we're going to have the 11 o'clock hour. And then we have a vision that Rick is going to talk about in just a moment about our procedure for moving ourselves forward in this. I'm not a scientist. Don't pretend to be a scientist. Did not do well in science. Know nothing about science. Had very little appreciation for science. I'm not a doctor. You don't want me being a doctor. And I was pretty good at ag with giving an animal a shot of combiotic, which was a penicillin type substance. But you didn't want me giving you a shot of combiotic. I'm not a doctor. I'm just a preacher. I'm just a gospel preacher. But I hope I'm a man of the book and a man of faith. And what I want to tell you, folks, is it's time. It's time to quit paying attention to science so much. It's time to quit paying attention to the medical people so much. And it's time to start putting our faith in God, who's bigger and greater and stronger and mightier. Man is never going to conquer. There's never going to be a time in which there's zero risk with any disease that is permeating itself on the face of this earth. We have poured dollars and research into cancer, into diabetes, into heart disease, and all kinds of things. Even our automobiles are much more safe because of the science and the technology and the technological advances of men. And who would have thought a year ago we'd be where we are now? A year ago, we were shutting things down. A year ago, the NBA was the first one to shut things down. They closed everything down. Then March Madness went by the wayside. And then like dominoes, everything fell. Everybody pulled inward. We didn't know what was going on. We didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't know how this was going to take place. And yes, there's been a great loss of life. I'm not minimizing that at all. And if you've been stricken with the positive effects of COVID-19, that is real. Both my 94-year-old dad and my 91-year-old mom had it. I understand what it does. I understand how it affects you. I understand the risk that's involved. But we've given far and wide enough attention to the risk, and we give far enough time to the devastation of something we're not going to control. I don't care how many vaccines we come out with. It's time we put our hand in the hand of the man who steals the water. And it's time we as people stop focusing on sight and we put ourselves in faith. And maybe that's a step at a time. I'm not saying we just jump in whole hog and a biscuit and get it all over us. I'm saying maybe it's a step at a time. But at least we need to start taking a step at a time. At least we need to start moving that mark forward here. We need to cease being stuck in place because we're dominated by science, by medicine, and by sight. And we need to be like Joshua and Caleb and say, whatever we face, we are able. And folks, if we don't believe that, if we don't believe that with our heart and our core, regardless of what the statistics are, regardless of what the risks are, then how much different are we? How much different are we than these children of Israel? Just put COVID-19 in there instead of the walls. God is greater than COVID-19. Did some of them die? Yes. In fact, all but 2 died in successive years, the next 40 years. Garrison Keillor, a humorist from Louisiana, once said, DNA was meant for reproductivity, not longevity. The moment we were born, the process of death was in place. But that process of death for us is different. That process for death for us is not the grave. That process of death for us is someplace else. We say this world is not my home, but have we packed our bags to stay here for 70 years? If this world's not our home, then my home's somewhere else and your home's somewhere else. How do I know that? By faith? I've not seen it. You've not seen it. We read about it. But if God was able to protect His children, that hasn't changed. God is still going to be able to protect His children. So whatever regulations come, whatever regulations don't come, whatever restrictions are removed, whatever restrictions are in place, whoever does it, God is greater. And we must embrace that. It's time we fully envelop that. We've given enough time to Satan to control our sight and to control our minds and control our hearts. It's time we put our hand in the hand of the man who steals the water. And if we stumble and fall and begin to sink, we can say, Lord, save me, and He'll pull us back up. My appeal to you this morning is this. My earnest appeal, my fervent appeal to you this morning is this. I'm not trying to poke my finger in anybody's eye here. I'm not trying to rebuke anybody here. I just want us to see there's another perspective we need to begin to embrace fully and confidently. We say we're children of God who walk by faith. Let's lift our heads up and look upward. And let's stop looking downward. Because everything that is in focus looking downward is nothing but decay. It's just a matter of time. But everything that is in focus looking upward is nothing but the bright shining sun with gates of pearl and streets of gold in the presence of Jehovah God. That is greater than anything in this world. John will say, greater is He that's in you than he that's in the world. Greater is He that's in you, in me, than he that's in the world. I just beg you. I beg you this morning. Please consider that. Please think about that. Please be reminded of that. And when we begin to shrink back, remember, we step out by faith. We don't walk by sight. We want to encourage anyone this morning. We want to encourage anyone this morning any way we can. And there's a time that you come in your life, you need to obey the gospel. We want that time for you to be now. We want to baptize you into Christ. We want to bring you to the Lord. So let that faith you have initially grow to be as great, to be strong to move mountains. That little mustard seed that starts to be a great mustard tree, great size of a mustard tree. If we can help you, you come while together we stand and while we sing.